Well, good morning, everyone. Good morning. Oh, come on.
Good morning.
Oh, yes, good morning. And to the many people watching at home, good morning to you all, too. It's so nice to see you live here. And for those of you connecting, thank you for doing so. First of all, calm down, everyone. Just settle down. Kim has an incredible presentation for you today. So I'm not going to stay up here for too long. Just wanted to share some thoughts before I welcome Kim Granillo to the microphone here. It's really been my pleasure to serve with Kim on the Advisory Budget Council. Did I get that acronym right, Kim? So Kim's a tri-chair along with Sherry Olson and Sasha Radicic. And what I've appreciated being a part of that group is really the way Kim has kind of led us through some very difficult and challenging conversations. So that's the first thing. I think the second thing is whenever money's involved, these are difficult conversations, but I've especially appreciated Kim's transparency through this process. And today is evidence of that. Kim's traveling throughout the district, doing the presentation that she did with the governing board a couple of weeks ago, Kim. And so without further ado, now she claims Mesa as her home. She's originally from Glendale, but today, please join me in giving a very warm welcome to Kim Granillo. All right. Also, to follow Kim, we'll have Paul DeRose to do kind of the local PC spin on this. But without further ado, Kim Granillo, our interim chief financial officer for the Maricopa Colleges. Thanks, Kim.
Thank you so much, President Imo. I appreciate that introduction. I'm not sure it's a fabulous and stimulating presentation, but I will do my best. We're hoping through this presentation, and Dr. Nomura was kind of getting towards some of these things, to create more communication and more transparency around the district-wide budgeting process, and really to help all of our employees come together and have a greater understanding of the budget and the financial situation for Maricopa. So as was previously talked about, this is the presentation that was provided to the governing board a couple of weeks ago. There are a few additional slides at the end, so if it's a snooze fest before that, tune in kind of towards the end part of the process as well. I will say, though, that there are people who have seen this presentation probably 5 times now, and the common theme is I get something new out of it every time I hear it. So if you want to do something else, especially if you're out in cyberspace and want to do something else as you're doing it and pick up a couple things that come in, great, more power to you. We will have the opportunity for questions at the end for sure, and then we will talk about and submission of any questions after that as well. So this isn't a one and done kind of situation. So our agenda for today are really 2 items. The first part will be on the expenditure limit, what it is and what it means for Maricopa, and then an update on the 23 budget, and we'll talk a bit about ABC that Dr. Nomura was referencing, and then our 23 budget recommendation, and then next steps. So for the expenditure limit, our first question always is, well, what is it? We hear about it. We were actually hearing about it more in the news today because of the K-12 issue, which I'm sure many are aware of. And so what the expenditure limit is it's a constitutional provision that was passed by voters and went into effect in 1980. It essentially, and its purpose is to limit the rate at which governments can grow using local revenues. That's in all caps for a reason, and we'll talk about that in the next couple of slides. The rate of growth is set by the type of government, so community college districts, K-12s, again, what we've been hearing about in the news, counties, cities, towns, et cetera. For community college districts such as Maricopa, the rate of growth is based on Ftse and inflation. And the inflation factor that is used, because I'm sure you're all aware too that there are several different choices to be used, but by statute, it is the GDP implicit price deflator. I won't say that 3 times fast. And it does lag 2 years. Enrollment and inflation from fiscal 21 will define our fiscal 23 expenditure limit, and we'll highlight that again in a couple of slides. So are all expenses subject to the limit? And the answer is no, only the expenses related to local revenues. And so, of course, what are local revenues? So, and as per normal, I think for Arizona, maybe all states and governments, it's not clearly defined in the Constitution. The Constitution does define, though, what is not considered local revenue. And for institutions such as Maricopa, that is tuition and fees, federal and private grant revenue and donations, general obligation bond proceeds. So people who've been here for many years know we've done general obligation bond programs for several years. We just wrapped up our 2004 program. The dollars we got from those bonds and then turned around and spent on construction, IT, ERPs, equipment, all of those different things, all of those were excludable when we had the GO bond proceeds. And then interest revenues as well. Local revenues then are everything else, which again for Maricopa includes property taxes, state aid, state and local grants, and most other auxiliary activities, and we'll have a clarification on the auxiliary activities in a minute. I have lots of things that we explain more about later. Expenses which can be excluded per the Constitution. So we talked about revenues, so expenses related to revenues on one side. On the other side, we also have some expenses, true expenses that we can exclude, and the Constitution allows us to exclude debt service payments. So we talked about the 2004 bond program. So we levy property taxes, a secondary tax, in order to pay the debt service, or essentially somewhat like the mortgage payments, the loan payments on those bonds, and all of that is excluded as well. And then expenses for buildings, land purchase, and construction are also constitutionally excludable. And so capital dollars that we spend on equipment, for instance, is subject to the limit. But if we build or buy a building or buy land, it's not subject to the limit. So you can tell that it's very convoluted and complicated topic. So by statute, we do have expenses which can be excluded too, and those are Prop 301 expenses, Prop 207 expenses, and then expenses related to entrepreneurial activities. So those entrepreneurial activities are part of our auxiliary programs typically, so some of them are excludable, some of them are not excludable. Just to highlight Prop 207 for a minute, the reason why it is excludable, if you go back and look at the ballot language, there was a sentence, I think either at the end or very near the end, that said revenues received under this proposition are excludable under the expenditure limit. So we've gotten a little bit smarter since 1980 and have included certain language in our ballot propositions to make sure that we can get them excluded, because otherwise we would get the money and we wouldn't be able to spend it. And so if you've been listening to the K-12 situation, that is the situation they are in right now. Their Prop 301 funds were determined to not be excludable under the limit, and so therefore they can't spend them, but they have the money already. So it's a very interesting topic, and I can't wait to see how all of that works out. So carry forward of excess capacity, community college districts are allowed to exclude or carry forward excludable revenues that aren't spent in the year in which they're received. So the easiest example I have is, so tuition and fees, as we've already said, are excludable. If we receive a certain amount of tuition and fees, but we don't spend it all, we get to carry forward whatever we don't spend, and it becomes an expenditure limit carry forward. Now, the very last bullet on this screen is very important. Expenditure limit carry forward capacity is not at all related to the Fund 110 budget carry forward that we talk about. So we use carry forward a lot, but these are not the same things, and they don't really need to be intertwined. This carry forward capacity does accumulate by fund and type of revenue. It's more about what my team does when we do our expenditure limit report versus anything else, but I just wanted to point out that it is accumulated by fund. And you'll see a little bit later why I wanted to make that point. Actually, you'll see it on this slide. So look at Maricopa's expenditure limit carry forward. So this is an overview from 2017 through 2023 is what we have projected. And if you look at the top line of that table, 2017 over on the far right, you'll see that, you can look at this side, about $418 million is what we had in total carry forward for our expenditure limit. By the time we finish our 2021 expenditure limit report, which is in process right now, we expect to be down to about $246 million. And on our current trajectory, we would be down to $105 million at 2023. So, $105 million sounds like a lot of money, but I'll remind everybody that we are 10 colleges and a district office, very decentralized activities, and a large budget, lots of Aged facilities, when we talk about fund balance, we talk about the fact that you can spend that 10 times without blinking an eye in an institution the size that we are. So $105 million of expenditure limit carry forward is not a place of comfort for me. I want to point out too that for 22, we did get some relief from the Arizona legislature, and we are able to exceed our limit by $57.4 million at a de minimis penalty of $20,000. And so we will plan on doing just that so that we will use less carry forward into the next year. And then the projections for 22 and 23, I just want to point out, are based on the information we had available and flat expenses and revenues over those same time periods. My point of saying that is that this is all subject to change based on what actually happens. We just needed to kind of get our heads wrapped around what we're looking at. So what does this all really mean for Maricopa? So that very first statement is a very technical statement. Enrollment losses are a double whammy for us. Lower excludable tuition revenue in the year of the loss. So if we look at 2021, which is extremely pertinent to us right now, we lost almost $50 million in revenue from lack of students, lost enrollment. So that, of course, hurt us in 21. And then when we come to our expenditure limit in 2023, 2 years later, we will also get hit with that lower enrollment because that will be a factor. We do have, again, the inflation factor too, and we all know that inflation has not been great. It is looking back at 21, so that offsets some of the loss. But just to be frank, it's a 16% loss isn't going to be recovered through GDP changes, cost of living changes. So that's just a real challenge for us. So our limit has actually gone down instead of up, which is not in our favor. And then the very last bullet there is very important for me to make sure everybody knows. It's not lawful for Maricopa's governing board to adopt a budget that violates the expenditure limit. I told them, I'll tell all of you, that's not something I would ever put forward anyway, and I don't think us as an institution, we would do that either. So that just means that we have some decisions and some choices to make. So addressing the expenditure limit. So of course, one of the things we can do is to look at raising tuition and fees because those are excludable revenues. If you've already seen this presentation, you already know that that's proposed for future years, not for 23. We also, of course, have the ability to reduce expenses that would bring us under the limit, it could potentially bring us under the limit. And then we've also included in the legislative agenda for coming sessions certain actions that we would like to have taken. One of the items is updating the calculation of Ftse. So right now, it's total credit hours divided by 30 is the Ftse definition for the expenditure limit calculation. And what we are proposing is to change that to a divisor of 24, which is the federal standard for a full-time student. And then the other thing we want to do is to seek an additional reprieve for fiscal 23, similar to what we have for 22, that if we exceed it by a certain amount, it's a de minimis penalty for us. I'm quite honestly not sure if either of those two things are going to get passed. So we're going to continue to move forward just, with the understanding that we're trying for those, but then we'll make adjustments as we need to if they don't come through. So the last bullet point there I think is very important for us as a system to start to think about. We are able to ask the voters in Maricopa County to reset Maricopa's base expenses based on some formula, and so that is yet to be defined for us. But Pima County Community College District successfully did this in 2020. And when I looked at their ballot materials that they used, they looked at their cost per Ftse back in 1980 as compared to all of their counterparts, the other districts. And Maricopa was right next to Pima in all of their calculations. So I think that'll be a place that we will start. But I also have to be clear that this won't happen until the 2024 election if we decide to go this route. For any of you who were around when we did the bond election in 2004 and 2002 and 94, it's a ton of work. We have to raise funds. It's a lot of effort for us to do it. We've also learned the hard way not to do a special election, so we're not likely to do that, and there's no way we can be ready in 22. So it won't happen until 24 if it does. And if that is the case, it's not effective until the following fiscal year, so that's not until 25-26 for us. So it's no immediate relief, but hopefully some assistance into the future. So that's it for the expenditure limit part, and I know that that is a ton of information, but the intention for that, number one, is to get greater understanding about a constraint, a real constraint we have on our budget as a community college district, but then also to set the stage then for the 23 budget discussion. So as Dr. Nomura was referencing, the Chancellor did establish the Advisory Budget Council, or ABC. You'll hear me call it ABC all the time. It was established by the Chancellor. The purpose was to discuss and provide recommendations to the Chancellor and CEC around revenues and expenses, budget, funding priorities, and then recommendations to the Chancellor, to CEC, and then ultimately to the Governing Board. The commitment is to be more inclusive and transparent throughout the budget recommendations as they're prepared. And then, of course, it is supported by the District Budget Office and various task forces. And I'll reference some of that work coming up. So the council membership is in front of you. Again, you can see the 3 tri-chairs as Dr. Nomura referenced. And the composition includes college presidents, district office leadership, faculty and adjunct faculty, staff senate, and chairs of senior councils. So I think it's a pretty good cross-section of Maricopa, and I'm sure Dr. Nomura can expand on if anybody's interested, but it seems to be a pretty effective group, or we hope it continues to be an effective group. So for this council, there were several sessions held to familiarize members with the district-wide budget. Quite frankly, too, a lot of this happened before I came into my position. So some of it I'm aware of, some of it I'm a little less aware of, but I know certain things that were happening. There were presentations from task forces on specific content areas. So workforce development came in and spoke about Prop 301, Prop 207 and STEM funds. HR came in with a presentation on the compensation plan. HERF funding was presented. I know that one happened because I did that one. And then also the expenditure limit to, again, try to get everybody on the same page as to the different constraints for Maricopa. And then ultimately in November, we presented 6 budget options to the ABC group for 23. And after looking at them, talking about them, well, before I get to that part, there were different combinations of revenue options that were considered. We talked about property taxes from new construction. So if you're not aware of how property taxes work, you can have a vacant piece of land that has one tax rate. And if somebody buys that and puts a business on it, puts apartments on it, it changes the tax rate for that particular plot of land, and that's considered new construction. And so we as a system are able to take advantage of any new construction dollars that come in without having to have board approval and without having to have a TNT hearing, a truth and taxation hearing. So Maricopa has done that for the entire time I've been here. We don't anticipate not doing that. It does range, you'll see some numbers in a minute, but it ranges about $12 million. At the height before the Great Recession in 2008, we were upwards of $17 million a year. So that's a great increase in revenue that helps us tremendously. But again, in parentheses, I can't stress enough that increases beyond that. That does also count against our limit. We're not excluded from the limit. But anything above that will further exacerbate our expenditure limit constraints. So you will also see in the coming slides, we're not proposing any new property tax increases above new construction. We also talked about tuition increases and differential tuition, which you'll hear more about later. We also talked about using HERF funds as one-time bridge funding for 23. Then on the expenditure side, we talked about budget reductions. We talked about using Proposition 207 funds, which again are new revenues to Maricopa, potentially as bridge funding, potentially as permanent funding. We talked about using some of the tax shift. So we talked about the bond program a couple minutes ago. So as it winds down and our debt service winds down on that, we then lower our tax rate for the secondary taxes. And so a few years ago, 3 or 4 years ago, we put forth a recommendation to repurpose some of that. We call that as a tax shift to fund our capital programs going forward since we don't have a capital revenue stream. And so that was approved by the board. They continue to support that, which we will do. And so our proposal is to repurpose some of that as annual capital allocations to the colleges and the district office divisions. And you'll hear a little bit more about that in a minute. So after reviewing the 6 options, ABC agreed to further evaluate 4 of them. We documented pros and cons for each, and then we also ranked them. And we ranked them from 1 to 4, and just to be clear, 1 is higher than 4, 1 is more preferable than 4. And option number 6, I think I would say was the clear number 1. Average ranking was 1.17, no ranking below 2. Option 4 was an average ranking of 2.17, mostly 2s, 1 3, 1 4, 2 1s. And then 3 and 5, I would say, were pretty much a tie for last, if you will. And they were 3.28, 3.39, and so pretty much 3s and 4s is where they fell. So ABC then agreed to forward the 2 top-ranked options to the Chancellor for consideration. After reviewing both of the options, Chancellor Gonzalez supported the top-ranked option, and that was taken to CEC, and there were no objections raised by CEC. So that is what you will see as the proposed option that was presented to the Governing Board a couple of weeks ago. Before we get to that one, though, I want to talk a little bit more, or show a little bit more about the current state of Maricopa if we continue on the path that we're on. And so if we look through this schedule, it's a busy schedule, I certainly understand that. But the top section are all about revenues, and those revenues at the very top line do include tuition and fees, property taxes, any other kinds of revenues that we have in the general fund, and I should be clear too, this is only the general fund, no other funds. You will also see the new property taxes that we are estimating over the coming years. This is a 5-year look, fiscal year 23 through 27. And then that middle section speaks to expenditures. One clarification I need to make is that the base expenses include any new expenses that were proposed and adopted in the prior year. It's a point of confusion for a lot of people. So if you look at that $25 million and other ongoing in fiscal 21, that's actually included in the $754 million in the fiscal 24 column. So we don't need to add it again. We've already included it in the base. So if we look at this, fully, and you look at that pink line about 3/4 of the way down the page, you'll start to see how quickly we burn through our fund balance. And that pink line is the amount of expenditures exceeding revenues in the given year. So a use of fund balance in that year. And then if you look at the very bottom line, you'll see our remaining fund balance, our ending fund balance for the year. That's not unrestricted, that's not undesignated, that's total fund balance. So by the time we get to fiscal 26 on our current trajectory, we will have spent all of our fund balance and then some. So this really is not a direction we can continue to march down. This is not a good place for us to be financially. So then when we look at the fiscal 23 budget as what was proposed to the board, or the direction, if you will, that is has been presented to the governing board, we've made a couple of adjustments. And so for fiscal 23, and we're just going to go from top to bottom so that I can try to make sure I cover all of the parts. And so if we look at revenues, it's the same as the current state on the previous slide. So one of the things I didn't point out on that slide is starting in fiscal 24, those base revenues do include a 2% increase in enrollment each year, starting in fiscal 24. So it is flat from 22 to 23. 23 does not have an increase, but we do have 2% increases in 24 and beyond. So this schedule still includes that. It does include, again, it has the new property included. You'll see that there's no property tax increase proposed. That line is empty. If you look at the next red line down, I'm sorry, I'm going to go back up to the first red line, that HERF dollars. So we are proposing to use $10.9 million of HERF funds for lost revenues for fiscal 23. I'm not sure we'll have a problem being able to calculate that and get that amount. And then down what we have are tuition increases, and we don't have anything again for fiscal 23, but we are looking at proposing a $3 increase each of the next years after that, 24 through 27. So it would be a total of $12 if we were to implement all of those by the time we get to fiscal 27. I have some graphs and stuff after this to talk about those tuition increases, so sit tight on that one for just a minute. And then the other thing that we are proposing that we consider and implement is differential tuition, and again, starting in fiscal 24. So I know that there's been some work done already. I'm not sure what all has been shared out there, but we've been able to cost out the instructional cost of our classes by prefix, and it really is just the instructor cost, not even all the instructional costs. And they range anywhere from a low of about $81 a credit hour up to $200 and $400 plus per credit hour, depending on what type of class it is. So everybody's paying the same $85 rate, whether the cost to provide the class is $400 or $81. So some institutions have gone to this differential approach, and so that is something that we are exploring right now and hope to have some more information on in the coming months to get us started for 24 if that is the direction we choose to go. So that's on the revenue side. And then on the expenditure side, again, the base expenses are included there. The required expenses on that first line are items such as employee compensation per the policy manual, so people who have educational advancement, people who have advancement for years of service, all of that is included in that line. It is based on policy, and we don't generally want to violate policy, so we continue to keep that in. Other ongoing includes the compensation plan, as was approved by the governing board last year. So you will see that that is included in every year. That is a value statement, a value commitment by our board and our institution to our employees, so that is in there. That number does also include a small amount increased funding for marketing and a small increase for the foundation in fiscal 23. And so I'm going to skip that next line that talks about budget reductions for 24 and 25 because I want to skip to kind of stay in the 23 range. And that next line down is a 1.5% budget reduction for colleges and district office divisions of 1.5%. And what we're planning to do with that is to backfill that reduction with the capital allocation that I was talking about earlier. So where we have the tax shift for deferred maintenance program, it's not exclusively for that. So we're going to repurpose about $10 million of that for the capital funding. That will be an allocation. The plan is for it to be an allocation to the colleges and the divisions for the coming future. So it's not a one and done. It will be ongoing. And I do recognize for some colleges that's an easier reduction than others because some colleges do budget that transfer that they're able to do on an annual basis straight as a transfer. And I've learned that some colleges don't. So I'm sure Paul will talk about that at some point for how PC does that. But it is a real reduction in the general fund budget for everyone. So I don't want to gloss over that. And then that last line there, the last red line is Prop 207 bridge funding. So the other proposal we have or we considered is a $5 million use of the Prop 207 funding that will be used for ongoing operations. And it will be ongoing into the future until the general fund is a bit more stable, and then we can consider doing something different. But that is not a one-time thing. That $5 million is actually included in the base expenses in 24. I say that because I have had people ask me, well, can we use $5 million each year? And the answer is yes, and we are. It's just kind of interesting how you put a budget together that you can't always see it quite so clearly. So then if I pop back up to that first red line that I skipped, so the other part of this is in 24 and 25, we are also proposing a 1% reduction for each of those fiscal years, 24 and 25. I want to share that we have a subcommittee of ABC that is charged with looking at those two budget reductions and looking at different ways in which we can implement that. So there is nothing that tells us it has to be a 1% across the board reduction. It's a 1% reduction to Maricopa as a whole. So how we choose to implement that is exactly how we choose to implement that. So they're considering different options. They're looking at different data points, and we're going to try to see if we can figure out how to implement that to make it as palatable as possible, but it is a real reduction that needs to happen in our expenditures. So with that, if I point you to that bottom pink line, the yellow and pink line, I guess, you'll see the numbers look a little bit better than that first schedule did. You'll see that we start to get to a balanced budget around fiscal 26 or 27. So I want to make sure that everybody realizes too, that means all those years prior to that, we're still out of balance. We're still spending more than what we're taking in. For most of us as households, that's not really the best option that we have. And it's not really a great option for our institution going forward. We have always had a balanced budget for years and years and years. So we need to get back to that being a standard practice for us. And so then it also saves our fund balance on that bottom line again. And I do want to remind everyone, because people look at that and say, you know, $170 million is a lot of money. Can't we use some of that? Well, clearly we are going to use some of that, but I can't stress enough again how big of an institution we are and how many times things come up that we don't know about. And I don't think I can stress enough either that HERF helped us in 21 because of our lost students, and we didn't lay anybody off. We didn't cut any expenditures whatsoever from anybody's budgets, but some of that was our fund balance as well that helped us. So I'm going to be the money person that hangs on to that as long as I possibly can. I think I'd rather use it strategically to invest in Maricopa versus using it because we have to or because we're afraid of the hard conversations. So I think that's just my mantra or my perspective, if you will. So back to the tuition rate discussion. So somebody had asked a question and we put together this chart and a whole bunch of us went, oh, wow, we hadn't really looked at it that way. So if we were to have raised tuition each year by the Consumer Price Index or HEPI, either one of them, we could conceivably be at a $96 per credit hour rate by the time we get to fiscal 22. And again, we're sitting still at $85 a credit hour. So nobody's suggesting that tomorrow we should be at $96 a credit hour. But the feeling from ABC for sure is that we really need to start looking at whether or not a tuition increase or tuition adjustment is really where we should be going. Part of that is about the expenditure limit conversation that we've been having. The other part of it is, you know, we're all experiencing inflation. Our students are no different, and I totally understand that. But we as an institution are also feeling that, and yet our students haven't had to I try to figure out how to say things delicately. Delicate is probably not my middle name. But they haven't felt any of that. We haven't passed any of that on to our students. And while I think that's great and wise, it also could potentially hurt us in the long run. So I think we need to be very conscious of those choices. And so this is just a picture that shows that, if a picture means more than a chart of numbers do. And again, this was just a stark contrast for me for what the difference was. The red and blue lines are the inflation factor, and the black bar is where we're actually charging tuition. So there clearly is some room for us to be able to make some adjustments, we believe. So I'm going to go back to this chart for just a second. The other thing that I want to stress, and I tried to stress with the governing board, because I'm quite sure they're not excited at all about the consideration of changing tuition, is that the reason why we're presenting a 5-year look is just to try to get our arms wrapped around Maricopa's finances. It's not often we do this look or that we've done this look, or quite frankly that we've had to do this look, but we're in a stage now that we need to. And so what we've got here is kind of a roadmap for Maricopa, what we've proposed as a roadmap. But I assure you, if we get to fiscal 24 and something changes drastically, and we don't really need to do a tuition increase in 25, or we don't really need to do a budget decrease in 25, we won't propose it. This is just about us trying to understand where we are financially. The other part of that is, so let's just say, I'm not saying this is what we're going to do. I don't think this is what we're going to do. That we had decided that no, a 1% across the board decrease for 24 and 25 is what we're going to do. This allows the colleges and the divisions to get an idea of how much it is that they need to be preparing for in those future years. And so the idea behind that is to be able to make more strategic decisions about what reductions need to be made. So if you have 2 positions in front of you and you know you can only fill one of them, which one strategically is the one you should fill versus maybe the one that came across your desk first? So it's not a place of comfort, and I'm quite sure Paul will agree with me on this. It's not a place of comfort to be having this discussion in February, knowing that you have to cut 1.5% or 1% out of your budget in the coming year. You don't have a lot of time to figure out strategically how you're going to do that. So that's kind of the other avenue behind this 5-year look, is so that we can start to plan and make better choices and have more choices in front of us versus, well, that's what we got to do, and this is the easiest thing, or this is the only thing I can do. So I can't really stress that enough either, that it's important for us to look at the 5-year look, but it is absolutely not set in stone. So the next steps with the governing board, March of '22, it's not possible, we will have a governing board work session to talk about, we'll provide updated numbers for fiscal '23 on the revenues for the general fund. For instance, we should get new construction numbers actually today, they're due out for '23, so that will help us to know how close our estimates are. In April of '22, we will have a first read of the budget documents. If any of you have ever printed it out, it's about yay thick. That is what the board looks at and reviews and adopts, so they'll get the first read of that in April. And then May of '22, we will have a TNT hearing, or Truth in Taxation hearing, which we're required to do whenever we raise property taxes above new construction. And again, the raise for that is only for the tax shift. It's not any additional property taxes. And then also the fiscal year '23 budget adoption, hopefully. So those were the last slides that went to the governing board. So I've added a few more slides for these presentations. And these are the next steps for all of us. And I have all of us in caps because I 100% believe we are all in this together. The budget office doesn't have some magic solution for how to balance the budget. I don't have a money tree parked in my backyard at home or at work. So we have to figure out how we come together and make some good decisions, good choices based on what we have in front of us. So again, we have basic tuition increase. We need to look at, and we've started this process, determining what data is needed, gauge the impact on students. We want to look at a differential tuition program, explore that, look at what other institutions are doing, document some options, develop a proposal. One of the things, for instance, is that if we decided that we wanted to have a tuition surcharge, if you will, on all nursing classes. I'm just going to pick on nursing. I think everybody knows that nursing classes are always more expensive. If we had a surcharge on that, what would it look like? What does it look like in year one? What does it look like in year two? If we figured out that, the right place for it to be is, and don't quote me on this because none of this research is finished yet, if we decided that it really needs to be $150 a credit hour, do we put that in all at once? Do we stair-step that in and we increase it $20 each year for the next 3 or 4 years? So all of those decisions need to be fully vetted, explored, and come up with options that are available to us. The other thing that I want to make sure of, and I said this at the board meeting, and I'm very much committed to this, and I think ABC is very much committed, and the Chancellor is very much committed, as well as I'm sure CEC is as well. We need to try to figure out kind of where a sweet spot is, where a tuition increase can benefit Maricopa. That's probably the easiest side of it, right? But not decimate our students. None of us are out to gouge our students. None of us are out to make it so that we're inaccessible to our population. That is not what Maricopa is about, and that is not what any of us would ever propose. So we need to figure out how we can move forward to a place where it's not going to hurt our students, but also help Maricopa going forward. So I am committed to that, and I think all of us are committed to that. So that means we have a bunch of work to do to be able to pull all of that data together. And again, anyone who's listening to the board, Dr. Thor had, her 2 or 3 or 4 things that she wants to make sure we cover, which I already had on my list, so I was pretty happy about that. We will do presentations to the governing board in June and then again in September on the tuition increase. So whatever we have available to us in June, that's where we'll start. And then hopefully September we can kind of tie things up. And if in fact the goal is to, or the idea is to do a tuition increase, we will look to get a tuition increase to the board for approval as soon as possible. That says October of '22. I'm not sure that's going to happen, but we want to be able to get it in place or passed so that IT can work on whatever it is that they need to do to get it correct in our system. That will not be a good thing if that blows up in our faces. And then we also want to be able to advertise to our students in as far in advance as possible so that they are prepared going forward. So we're trying to do this the right way, or the best way we can, knowing that it likely won't be pleasant for anyone. And then when it comes to the budget reductions, again, just to recap, it's 1.5% in '23 and then 1% each in '24 and '25. So I'm sure you all can add that is 3.5% over those 3 years. I will add that we did about a 1% reduction in '22, so it's really 4.5% over 4 years, which for Maricopa is fairly significant. Hopefully it will be enough. And then the sub-team of ABC is working on options around implementing those reductions as we've talked about. And then just some additional comments, because I feel like, again, we need to be very transparent and have full disclosure on all of this information. And I'm sure you're all aware too, that trending data suggests that enrollment's not likely to return to pre-pandemic levels in the coming years. If the governing board is not inclined to raise tuition or implement differential tuition, I don't know that we have options other than additional budget reductions. So I'm not trying to back the board into a corner at all. I just think we have our work cut out for us to make sure that they understand and appreciate that, again, it's good for Maricopa and it doesn't decimate our students. So we have to figure out how to provide that picture. And then the last bullet point I think is important for all of us. Cost efficiencies gained throughout the system could negate the need for additional reductions, whether it's those 2 1%, or if the board chooses not to raise tuition, additional cuts that we may have in the future. So I think it's incumbent upon all of us to really look at what we're doing, what we're involved in, what we do 10 different ways, 11 different ways, because we have some things we do 11 different ways, and try to figure out, is there a way for us to streamline things, to make things more efficient, more effective, that we could actually pull that savings out of Maricopa's budget and use that to offset some of these reductions. Or again, if the potential is that we can do that and not have to raise tuition in 26 and 27, wouldn't that be great? And I think it puts Maricopa's best foot forward. So again, that's just kind of my plea to everyone for all of us to be working on this together. And so that's the end of mine. I know Paul's going to come up and talk about, sorry, I moved away from the mic. Paul's going to come up and talk about PC's budget process, and then we can take any questions after that. Do we want to do questions first? Do we have any coming in? No. Okay, no questions have come in yet, so come on up, Paul. Oh, yes. I forgot we do have an audience.
Actually, I have 3 questions. First is, when you talked about the legislation, you talked about changing it to 24 Ftse versus 30. Aren't all the universities at 24 right now? So
Yep.
what we're doing is just asking to be the same.
Yep.
Okay, that's just a question.
And you
Or
would
a
think
statement
it
more than a
wouldn't
question.
be, you would think it wouldn't be a hard answer, right?
Yeah, I know.
It will be a challenge for us to get that changed.
Okay. Second question was, does the property tax projections include the 15 to 20% increase in property values that we've received?
So, how community college districts levy their taxes, it's based on a dollar amount, not a percentage. So we are technically able to increase our tax levy 2% each year. People assume that means the tax rate. It's not, it's the dollar amount. So if we had a levy of $400 million, we would be able to levy 2% more than $400 million. And then how that gets distributed amongst the taxpayers is however their valuations have happened. So if you have an area that has a higher valuation than another one does, that one pays a little bit more in property taxes than the other. So when we have massive amounts of increases in value, it doesn't change Maricopa's picture whatsoever. It just changes what the individual taxpayer contributions are to our flat $400 million amount.
Okay.
I hope that makes sense.
Yes. And then the third question I have is, do any of your projections include the bachelor's degree expenses and revenues?
Very good question, and thank you for that question. Thank you for all of your questions. And quite frankly, it does not. The only thing that is in there is there's a $700,000 number that I didn't point out on the current state slide, and that is what has been estimated as the district-wide cost to implement bachelor's degrees in 23 and 24. And we're working now, there is a group that is working on the kind of the budget process, if you will, of 4-year degrees, and that is not finished yet. So that will be either an additional cost or a reallocated cost that we will have going forward, and then additional revenue. But we're still working on what all of those numbers are, so there wasn't really anything I could put into the presentation that would have any value whatsoever, other than to say it's coming. Thank you. Any other questions before I turn it over to Paul? Okay. And I'm not going anywhere, so.
Thank you so much, Kim. Let's give Kim a little round of applause. I appreciate that. Very, very informative. And Kim, something you mentioned earlier, when you see some things more than once, you learn something new. I learned something new after your presentation today, so thank you so much. And I applaud you for this presentation, but specifically for the 5-year roadmap that you presented to us. As you all know, that's been a struggle for us, and it's been a struggle to plan. And knowing that we could potentially have some reductions coming up in the future, I think can definitely help guide the work that we do, as opposed to learning something in February, like you said, and trying to adjust and make those adjustments for July. So thank you. I applaud you again for that. I appreciate that. Well, good morning, PC, and to everyone virtually online. I wanted to give a brief update on our budget today. And following Kim's presentation, you'll see a lot of things that we're doing or we're planning to do will be aligning to the work that's being done right now at our district office. So I got about 8 slides or so that I'll go through with you this morning. And so let me go ahead and get started. So first, I thought I'd start out with an overview just on how our base budget is allocated. And this presentation is on the general fund, which is Fund 1, or our operational fund. So you may hear those terms all throughout the presentation. It's all referring to the same fund, actually. And so our operational fund is the base budget and the dollars that we spend day to day to help run our operations. And so this slide here just kind of breaks it down by function. Note it is not by the 4 areas of the campus, like administrative services, academic affairs, student affairs, and the president's office. Those are titles that colleges make up on their own and give to themselves. But we report our budget based on function, and that's what you're seeing here. And so $63.3 million is what is in our base budget in our operational general fund. And so you could see, just as an example in the first line, $27.2 million of that $63.3 million is allocated towards our instructional costs. And that is direct instructional costs. One example would be our residential faculty costs or our adjunct costs, the costs directly related to students inside the classroom. And you could see some of the other things on there. Institutional support could be things like IT, HR, our development office, marketing. Student services, pretty self-explanatory, and operations as well. Academic support would be things like administrative help for the instructional areas, as one example. And then scholarships, I think pretty self-explanatory there. This same information, broken down in a different way, is by expense type. So again, our same $63 million, just how is it allocated by our expense type? And expense type, this is how we report on our financials. So our payroll and benefits, as you can see, is almost 80% of our base budget. And this is in descending order, and you could kind of go through the list here. I won't run through each of them with you. But when we start thinking about some type of budget reduction, as you could see here, outside of the payroll and benefits and our fixed charges, there's not a lot of budget out there. And so we have to really think strategically and take a deep dive and think about, what can we do to meet the needs, not only of our campus and the priorities that we have, but then any potential upcoming budget reductions that we may be faced with. So again, just overview information on these first 2 slides. Let's get into questions I get asked. How does base budget become available? I have needs in my area. I have some priorities that need some money. How can I get some base budget? The first category on ways we generate that base budget is through salary savings. Salary savings is our most common way of generating base budget, but it's not always a high dollar amount, and it does vary from year to year. It's not a set dollar amount whatsoever. But what salary savings is in a nutshell, it's when an employee separates and we hire the replacement at a lower salary. And so if the employee who separated was making $50,000 annually, we have budget set up for that, of course, to pay that person. And when that person separates and their replacement's hired at just say $40,000 annually, that's $10,000 the college now has in the form of salary savings that is unallocated at that point, because we reduced that position down to $40,000 based on the current employee that was hired. So that's our most common. Another category is enrollment growth, and this is our current budget model, I'll say, is factored on enrollment growth. And so as enrollment goes up, we receive additional funding to help support the additional students that we have on campus. But then consequently, as enrollment goes down, our budgets are reduced accordingly because we're not providing the services to as many students. And so if enrollment was going up in a perfect world, we would have some enrollment growth funding based on our current formula, and that would be available for reallocation. Third is attrition, and you heard Kim reference this in her presentation. This is the natural downsizing of a workforce. It's not a forced reduction in force, but simply if employees have separated and you have, let's say again, Kim's example, 2 employees or 2 vacated footies in front of you, and you have to decide which one to fund, and you decide to fund one of them, releasing the budget from the footie that you did not fund becomes attrition. And that's the budget that then becomes available if you decide not to fill lines and reduce or eliminate positions permanently. But again, not filled positions, vacated positions. Fourth is budget reallocation, and that's quite simply a deep dive into the way our base budgets are currently allocated, and a deep dive into reviewing how our operations are funded, what expenses we have in each of the areas. Are certain areas over-allocated? Are certain areas or business processes changing, and maybe they don't need as much funding as they do now? And so is there any potential opportunity to examine the $63 million that we have now and take little pieces maybe here and there and reallocate it? So it's all within the existing $63 million. It's not additional budget that's coming in when you do a budget reallocation. And then lastly, campus-wide efficiencies. And so if we change potentially our business practices to become more efficient, that would definitely recognize a budget savings. And I'll give you one example that we did a few years ago is our LED lighting retrofits. All of our lights now, we started on the exterior and moved to the interior, but we've replaced our lighting with LED fixtures. And so that has realized a savings for us. This slide has a lot of information. I know it's going to be maybe a little difficult to digest. I won't go through each line individually. But speaking of budget reallocation, what I just talked about on the last slide, this is one example of a budget reallocation exercise that the college did. And there was a team put together that included college leaders and representatives from all the employee areas. And we had meetings and looked at our budget last fiscal year coming into this fiscal year because we knew that there was going to be an upcoming budget reduction. And so we identified 3% of our budget that could potentially be reallocated. And on the screen here is just what made up that 3% of potential budget reallocation. And so it was about 1.8 million if you see on the very last slide. And the very last bullet there on this slide actually was a liquidation of 6 vacant footies. So that's back to the attrition example. We had decided to liquidate those vacancies. But now the flip side of that, so we had 3% identified as a potential budget reallocation opportunity. In the end, we decided to reallocate 2%. after we realized that there would be a 1% budget reduction for this fiscal year. And so you could just kind of go through and see where that 2% was reallocated to. These are some of the areas that came up either as under budgeted or new priorities for the college. And so almost $1.5 million of that 1.8 was reallocated to these areas. So I know a lot of information. I was just giving you a few extra seconds to read through the lines. This presentation will be available and posted on our webpage as well. All right. So we've talked about base budget. How about non-base budget? You always hear, I'm sure you probably have heard anyway, the term one-time funds. What is one-time funds and how do I get my hands on it? How can I spend it? So one-time funds is money that becomes available throughout the fiscal year based on our base budget allocations. So in a nutshell, it's unspent base budget that just becomes available for one reason or another, and I'll give you some of those examples here. Our first and probably most common is vacancy savings. And vacancy savings in a nutshell is when a budgeted employee separates and it's the time in between that position being, or that person separating and the position's vacant and we're doing the search to replace the position. Let's say that search took 6 months. Well, that was 6 months worth of vacancy savings that we didn't pay to any employee because the position was vacant for those 6 months while we were doing the search. So again, it was base budget allocated for the position. We didn't take it away from the departments or the college. It was still there, but it just took 6 months to fill. And so we did not have payroll expenses for that position for 6 months. That base budget or that savings turns into what we call one-time funds. That's available right now this fiscal year, but not beyond June 30, which is the end of the fiscal year. So that becomes money that has to be spent now. The second category, we call it salary differential. This is basically salary savings that I talked about in the last slide, but salary savings is the base budget that's available on July 1st of the upcoming year, a new budget cycle, a new budget year. But there's also a one-time savings that comes from that. And that one-time savings is the amount of money from that salary savings for the current fiscal year. So salary savings and employee hire generates 2 buckets of savings, a permanent savings and a one-time savings for the current fiscal year. And then there's always fund balance. You heard Kim reference fund balance. We monitor our fund balance all throughout the year as well. Most recently, in the last couple of years, we've had more fund balance than we've had in years past. And that's because during our COVID times and the adjustments that we've made, our business has changed. We're not holding or hosting the same events as one example that we used to have. We're just not operating the same way these last 2 years. And so when you've had budget allocated for a specific purpose and you're not holding those events, all right, or you're not spending the money for that specific purpose, let's say, that becomes savings for that fiscal year, and that becomes one-time funds. And we tend to see the majority of our one-time funds become available in the 4th quarter, and you probably have seen call-outs from college leaders saying, we have X amount of dollars available for one-time use. Are there any needs you may have in your areas? Those tend to come towards the 4th quarter of the fiscal year as our reports are shoring up a little bit more and more as the months go by, and we're seeing how fast or slow in this case we're spending our base budget dollars that have been allocated. Change in business practices, like I mentioned on the last slide, that could always potentially recognize some type of savings, and so we always want to be mindful of what can we do better or more efficient. And then lastly, non-operational dollars are one-time funds. They're not base budget. It does not roll over year to year. Some funds do, or some types of grants, let's say. We have committed funds for a 5-year let's say, period, but they're not necessarily base budget. We look at them as one-time funds, and two examples I have on the screen here are any type of grant, and then Prop 207 and 301. Again, that money's allocated to us on an annual basis. It's not a guarantee that we'll have those funds. It's also not a guarantee in some cases that we'll have the same amount of funds from year to year. Fluctuations definitely can occur in these areas. And to give you a sense of our one-time funds, and this is specific to the vacancy savings and the salary differential I mentioned on the last slide, we track that every year. And this is actually posted on PC's budget webpage, and it's updated quarterly. So at any time you can go out and see how much the college is generating in one-time funds through any type of personnel change, which again, vacancy savings and salary differential here. But if you just net the two, I'll round up and call it 1.2 million. So last fiscal year alone, the college recognized $1.2 million in one-time funds related to some type of personnel changes going on throughout the year. It's a lot of money. And this is the pot of money that we use to hire like short-term employees. Employees who do not have a budgeted footy, a budgeted line. We tap into this money, and that's how we're able to create some of those short-term positions that may be in your areas or that you may have an interest in potentially creating in the future, and you want to get your priority or your request in. So there's money out there from year to year. We track it. On average, it is about 1.2 million just in these categories alone. And so what we do as a leadership group is we end up allocating that up front at the start of the fiscal year so we can do things at the start of the semester. We can have, let's say, short-term OYOs in place in August. So we're kind of pre-spending, if you will, knowing that from year to year, we usually generate about 1.2 million in vacancy savings. All right, last slide. So what about future fiscal years? Well, for upcoming 22-23, there will not be any adjustments to your base budgets. So the budgets allocated to your departments now will remain intact. You heard Kim mention there will be a 1.5% budget reduction district-wide for all the colleges. But fortunately for Phoenix College, we are one of those colleges that we're budgeting for that capital transfer from year to year. And so you heard Kim say that will be the offset pretty much, right? So our college's base budget will be reduced 1.5%, but we will be getting a 1.5% allocation automatically in our Fund 7 or capital fund. And so for Phoenix College, it's an offset because we have budgeted for that. So we can just reduce that transfer amount in our Fund 1 by that, which is awesome. So no impact to us is the bottom line. And so good news on that one. With that, there will be one-time funds available for next fiscal year. There's always going to be one-time funds available. So although there's not base budget available for you to potentially have allocated to you this upcoming year, there will be one-time funds available. So I encourage you to work with your leaders, your supervisors, the leaders in your areas to identify what types of priorities you may have a need for the upcoming fiscal year, and work through our existing business processes to get those requests submitted. Our planning cycle for fiscal year 23-24 is open right now, and you could submit your budget requests and your objectives all through our strategic planning online software, which is the acronym SPOL. We're very heavy on acronyms in this organization, and you may have heard that acronym SPOL. That's what it is, Strategic Planning Online. It's just a software tool that we use to submit our objectives and to submit our base budget requests for the upcoming fiscal year. And we're always a year and a half out. As you can see here, we're already planning for fiscal year 23-24. Fiscal year, our budgets for 22-23 are set. And so we're now looking into 23-24. And we will be utilizing our newly formed shared governance interest councils. I'm sure many of you, if not all of you, have heard us talk about this for the last several months. These interest councils are formed. Their work will be beginning in March, just next month. And so everything you see on these bullets here related to budget, whether it be base budget requests or one-time funds requests, will all route to the shared governance interest councils. That will be the body that will be reviewing and prioritizing these requests as they come in. And then the Budget Review Committee, of course, will also be actively looking at our budgets. And we will begin a discussion on the development now of a 1 to 5 year budget plan in alignment with the budget roadmap, we'll call it, that Kim has presented to us today. So now that we have an idea of what that roadmap is, we, Phoenix College, can finally start to try to plan for up to 5 years out. And so the Budget Review Committee will be a key contributor to that discussion and will host those discussions throughout the next year. And speaking of Budget Review Committee and the interest councils, they are all open meetings. All employees are welcome to attend any of those meetings. We hope to get the new schedules for the shared interest councils out on our webpage that's being developed right now. And so employees at any time can click on that website, get information, see when the councils are meeting, and potentially attend meetings if you choose to. Completely up to you all. So that was my last slide. So let me ask if there's any questions from the audience, and then I'll ask for online questions. Anybody in the audience have a question? All right, anything from online? No, okay. All right, everyone, I think we are good. Well, I want to thank you for coming today, whether you're in person or online. Thank you for being part of this budget presentation. I encourage you to stay involved and to stay up to date with our budget conversations going on, again, either through the shared interest councils or through the Budget Review Committee. But even though you may or may not be a participant or a member, if you will, on those committees, please stay involved the best that you can. We try to be very transparent and open with our communications and the information that we're talking about. And visit the budget website. We keep that updated on an ongoing basis, and so there's always a lot of information that's posted out on our budget website. So thank you all. Have a great rest of your semester, and I appreciate your attendance today.